Project AHO is a medium-scale campaign for Skyrim that dips into a science fiction kind of narrative we don't typically see in Skyrim lore. And maybe a while back we could have questioned how well this fits into the lore, but maybe not as much now that ZeniMax has released the Clockwork City for Elder Scrolls Online, which, by the way, someone needs to explain to me how you can have robotic machines that appear to have the computational capacity far beyond any 21st century computer, while at the same time nobody in Tamriel has an iPhone or gunpowder for that matter. Wasn't there a question some time ago about PvP siege weapons in ESO and how fighters didn't have gunpowder circa Second Era 280 because it wasn't around at that time? Fast forward to the Fourth Era and I still don't see flying spaceships, but Sothasil can have robots in his little world because of reasons. As usual, I'm going to trim down some parts that are easily solvable, and any part where I get into dialogue with NPCs that isn't too important. I'm also going to look at the exteriors, or what you could say are the exteriors, or areas of nature, and distinguish them from interiors, so there will be two different level sets I'll talk about. Also, if you're here for the walkthrough, I'll just lay everything out that you probably want to know right here so you don't have to skip ahead. First thing you'll want to do when you enter the main town is gather Jazbay grapes, as many as you can. They're placed on the ground everywhere, but it's easy to find them in front of homes. I believe you only need 4 or 8 of them. Also gather 2 thistle branches and 4 flying aminata, as you'll need to do a certain quest twice if you're going the straightforward way. As you go through the campaign, you'll encounter 3 prowlers, which are those giant walking machines with spheres for heads. Every time you kill one, take its power core, as you'll need 2. The prowlers are located in the giant cave, the library, and the west end of the Dwemer underground dungeon. Collect 16 Dwemer ingots and 3 gold ingots. The 3 gold ingots you can find on the west end of the Dwemer dungeon. This walkthrough will show you where that is. I think I covered most of the confusing parts, except for also the library, where you have to find a book in a specific quest where you go with your master down to find certain books. It's somewhere in the center. The quickest way is just to collect all of them, because I don't recall exactly which one it is, although I think it's near the one that's called the Blessed Homilies of Almalexia, somewhere around there. But you will definitely find it in the center. So let's get on with the campaign.
Get down to work. Just love bothering busy folk.
I'm going to skip over some of the intro as it's quite straightforward. Now, I'm personally not a fan of the way they introduce the campaign, because putting a message prompt on your screen and explaining what will happen is kind of silly, and there are just so many ways that the designers could have introduced the player to the campaign without being lazy and putting a message prompt on the screen. Basically what happens is an orc deceives you and gives you a bunch of hallucinogens, and you end up in the Mushroom Kingdom. Well, you get sold as a slave and then that happens, basically. So anyway, let's look at the introduction. So the structure of the exterior is actually orderly It's just that the strong bloom effect and high contrast in lighting sort of obfuscate the layout. But it's easy to notice that if you pay attention to it, it has a semi-organic layout where the town encircles the center. This is quite innovative, as there isn't really any template that villages in Skyrim use in order to construct the layout of their exteriors like this. In addition, there are seldom any mods which have used the mushroom village layout that we had a glimpse of in Solstheim, so seeing this is a visually fresh start. The interiors are also quite innovative and have a strong sense of structure emphasized through things such as the repetition of motifs and the constructions of motifs using smaller meshes of the same architecture set. With this style of design, the levels have a distinct personality that uniquely separates them from any conventional layout you'd see in other mods and in Skyrim. Many of the regions in Cells have a quality of aesthetic in their ability to use repetitive motifs that harmoniously coincide with the layout of the level. One example would be in the underground waterworks, where pillars lie opposite to the walkway along more elaborate designs. This allows the viewer the ability to more easily scrutinize and distinguish visual descriptions of scenes. Repetition of aligned objects allows the human brain to process simultaneously the figures of visual stimuli. The introduction to the world is kind of awkward because it's so artificially and obviously so conveyed. And the first scene prior to the beginning of the first quest, in addition, was kind of awkward too, namely because of the horrible voice acting and the robotic Oblivion style cutscene that plays out. Or maybe Skyrim-esque in the sense that everyone kind of has their part and says a few words, and the voice acting is adequate or professional, but the way that the scene is kind of played out is not convincing and just looks like a bunch of NPCs doing robotic things. After that, however, you remain fairly immersed in this new world. Now, I found the more I think about it that it's more difficult to define immersion in a visual context than meets the eye. But I can lay out a comprehensive case for the need to scrutinize it as part of the overall gaming experience in a twofold way. Maybe this applies to certain kinds of worlds in certain kinds of games, and it's not really applicable overall to level design. But I tend to think that it remains a very broad quality that applies to most of them. And that's sort of a different topic anyway. If we just focus on games like Skyrim for a moment, I would go so far as to say that it is part of almost everyone's gaming experience. If it's not immersive, Skyrim players won't act like they're in the world. They'll act like they're playing a game. And of course I don't have the data that demonstrates that that's their behavior, but it almost seems evident that without the kind of immersion that players expect in Skyrim, that is kind of the spirit of the game in the first place, people will act differently in the least towards something that is not immersive in Skyrim. I don't know enough about any research that has been done in things like acting and such other activities to make a clear statement, so I'll probably come back to this, but acting in such other activities would require the participants to believe in a fantasy to become more believable themselves. I think that this particular quality may be linked to the mechanisms prompting similar behaviors seen in children playing, where they act out roles and behave as though they're in a fantasy. If that's the case, though, there's also the need to distinguish between male and female processing of the fantasy world, as male and female brains process fantasy play in childhood distinctly, so they would necessarily process the same thing as adults or as adolescents distinctly. All that is kind of reaching, mind you, because it's very difficult to find research that identifies and pinpoints fantasy play behavior in players playing certain games. So take all of that with a grain of salt. But at the very least, an intuitive but clear description of what visual immersion signifies is how easy it is for players to believe that they are in another world. And a simplified question thereof that we can actually answer is, does this look like a world you could live in? In other words, solely in the visual realm, does the level in question look like an artificial, synthetic, plastic 3D world created by someone, or does it look like it exists, or it could exist and you're in the center of it? Think about this. Say I take a high-definition picture of an interesting place on Earth. It would have to be visually immersive in the sense that you can stand there in real life. Say I make a 3D panorama and post it online. You believe that you could be in that space. You could clearly see yourself in that space. I mean, after all, that place does exist in the world, and I took sort of larger-than-life pictures and stitched them all together to create this panorama, and you can easily imagine yourself in that world because, of course, it's somewhere you can go in real life. And maybe that's what the goal of the quality description of visual immersion is. And it's pretty evident at this point that no other aspect is similar enough to it that we can collapse the two and conclude that they're basically the same thing, so there's no point in having a duplicate. Basically, think of it this way. Say your eyes are glued to the screen because the mod has been so great thus far. And then you find a weird bug that clips off half the level, and everything is purple because of a missing texture or something. At that point, surely you would realize, oh, hold on a second. I'm not in Skyrim, I'm in a video game, and this is all fake. And typically, a tool for these kinds of things to see if this kind of quality even exists is to take the very extreme, as I just demonstrated, and see if that does something that you claim it does. In this case, well, it kind of breaks the player's immersion. So if at the very extreme something like that can happen, maybe you can find lesser extremes that demonstrate it to lesser degrees. And there are all kinds of examples in Skyrim where there's weird bugs or there's clipping, etc. that it kind of makes you realize, oh hey, hold on a minute. I'm not in Skyrim, I'm not in this fantasy world, I'm playing a video game. And part of the experience of these kinds of games is to, whether it's something you like or not, glue the player to the screen in a way so that they will have an immersive experience and they are kind of attached to whatever is going on in there and they want to keep playing it. Now maybe all of this might just be that a sample of the population kind of behaves that way, that is more prone to play fantasy games and is more interested in fantasy games. That's something to be discussed, but as of the moment it's pretty clear to me that visual immersion exists and it is something to pay attention to. Now, there are some portions of this mod that are lackluster, and it's really strange because you can have a detailed corridor that hits all the right notes, And then you have a massively scaled static mesh whose texture is so blurred out it looks hideous and fake. And it's also strange because it's obvious the designers knew how to make advanced animated meshes, and yet they couldn't take the time to properly scale certain meshes so that their textures scale or tile properly. There are also some cases where the lighting is overpowering, or some meshes don't blend well with a strong bloom and highly saturated color. One example of that would be the various colors applied to vegetation when you're going to the Dwemer machinery room, and you'll notice that some of that vegetation is kind of artificially colored, highly saturated and unnatural color that would blend in if it were kind of tailored to blend in with that scene, but does not. Generally, it's clear that the designers have a distinct ability to play with colors and use strong colors or highly saturated colors to convey mood across their levels. And they also demonstrate that they can do this for different moods. The underground farm has a homogeneous color distribution as compared to the variety of colors seen in the center of the village. Unfortunately, that kind of style of lighting becomes increasingly more difficult to use as you keep populating clusters of lights and give stark contrast in small regions. So the overall appearance can be overpowering, and some of the lighting didn't sit well because of the way it failed to blend with the meshes in the background of the scene. In larger cases, one of the less extreme cases would be the background of the mushroom town, where the glow that's kind of circling the silhouette of the branches doesn't really fit very well. I mean, it's colorful imagery, but it looks artificial. Auditory immersion fares better overall and kind of outdoes what is expecting using Skyrim's Dwemer Ruins as a baseline. In every area where there is activity, there are sounds of Dwemer machines rattling in your ears. And one curious case was the chamber with the Dwemer machinery all about, wherein one of the prowlers linger. It feels very chaotic, and it's a great example of how the whole area works to convey a specific mood. Now, as far as the overpowering of colors, although for the most part that kind of technique works well here, there are some cases, particularly in the mushroom town, where it kind of didn't really fit because either the colors were clashing or they were overpowered, and it didn't really do well for the textures or the mesh layout there relative to what it could have been had it had a closer, let's say, a cluster of color distributions. But overall, it is a technique that in the end worked out pretty well. No doubt the levels are detailed. Basically every room except for the hallways and corridors and other travel mediums are decorated in a Skyrim style fashion, where there's an abundance of material of some sort. And by the way, that's another thing you might have noticed in Skyrim. the item placement in dungeons in Skyrim is very cinematic. And by that I mean that, for example, that's the kind of exaggerative decoration you'd see in a Hollywood film. So, for example, if you go to a crypt in old Europe, you're not going to find a pile of gold coins and coin pouches and jewels and swords all sort of aesthetically stacked on a table with skulls with candles on top of them illuminating the whole thing and making it look sort of like a golden scene. That's kind of something that comes out of Hollywood. You'll probably just find discarded and uninteresting items among garbage in dark, gloomy little rooms, and just go ahead and look at various catacombs in the ancient parts of France or Germany, etc., and you'll basically find that's the case. The whole point of the item placement here, though, is to contribute to the visuals of the environment and make it appear visually rich. But whether the designer chooses the way of Skyrim or a more realistic route doesn't matter as long as both are convincingly detailed. But that's just one thing that was interesting here.